This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
We have a very unusual practice. Tisha B'Av is the culmination of 3 weeks of mourning. 3 weeks we delay any celebration, we push off weddings, we don't take haircuts. We mourn the devastating tragedies that have occurred throughout history. First Beis HaMikdash, second Beis HaMikdash. Yerushalayim is our life. We say Rachem al Tzion ki Beis Chayenu. We move into a more intense period of mourning, the 9 days, which was like Avelos. We don't wash, we don't eat meat. Lo Yaleinu, it's like a Shiva. Then we come to Shavuot Shechal by Tisha B'Av, where the Avelos is even more intense. We have Erev Tisha B'Av. Sudas Hamafsekes, Chazal say, is K'meisai Muta Lefanav. And after mourning for so many tragedies, finally the wretched day is here. It's Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah says at the end of Tainus, 5 tsaras happened on Tisha B'Av. First Beis HaMikdash, second Beis HaMikdash, Beitar, Tornis Rufus. Many tragedies have occurred throughout history. The Abarbanel writes in Hosea, community of England was expelled in 1295. Community of France was expelled on Tisha B'Av. Of course, the Spanish expulsion was on Tisha B'Av. World War I breaks out on Tisha B'Av. It's the most wretched day on the calendar, to the point where the Navi Yirmiyah, who was born on Tisha B'Av, cursed the day of his birth. And here we are, it's Tisha B'Av, and we have this unusual practice that come midday, we get off the floor. Isn't that strange? After we reach the crescendo of Avelos, we're here. The day is here. We give it a few hours in the morning, a few hours last night, and that's it. We get off the floor, we put on the tefillin, it's kemat over. What's the meaning of this custom? What's the meaning of this practice? Why do we get off the floor in middle of the intense Avelos? Tisha B'Av is a very difficult day for everybody. We read the kinnis, we try to feel the tsar, we try to feel the pain, we try to connect, we try to have genuine feelings of sorrow, but at the same time, we feel that our hearts are hardened. We feel coarsened. We feel jaded. What do the kinnos really mean to us? What is the relevance to us? What can we take out of it? What do kinnos mean for a yid today in Tafshin Ayin Zayin? Rabbi Berelwein tells a story how in 1994 he moves to Eretz Yisrael, he makes Aliyah, and he musters up the courage to do what many Americans are afraid to do. He's going to get an Israeli driver's license. Now, while many Americans fail their first attempt, and the law in Israel is the tester is not allowed to let on, not what the final score is and not how the driver is doing, somehow the tester sort of lets it slip, Rabbi, you know, you're a pretty good driver. So Rabbi Wein says, exactly what impressed you about my driving abilities? So the tester said, look, you did what nobody does. Everybody else just pulls right out. But Rabbi, before you pulled out of the space, you actually looked in the rear view mirror to see if there was oncoming traffic. Nobody does that. Moreover, Rabbi said that is precisely the problem with contemporary society. Many people think, the Jewish world began on Ocean Parkway in 1950, 1970, or 1980, and Jewish life began in Brooklyn. And we drive ahead with our lives and we move forward into the traffic of our current and future existence, and sometimes with disastrous results. But we can only proceed successfully if we could look clearly in the rear view mirror of Jewish history, because only if we know where we come from and what we've endured and what we've suffered can we have an idea where we need to go and how we're going to get there. And that's the vital role of Tisha B'Av. and the critical value of the kinnis. 1942. There's a young boy, 5 years old, and he's sticking out his neck to get what will be the last glance of his revered father. His father was the Rav of Pietrikov, and he sees his father, and this little boy, Yisrael Meir, sticks out his neck to see his father standing at the Umschlagplatz, the assembly port for deportation. Rav Moshe Chaim Lau was one of the Gedolei Rabbanim in Europe before the war. And he's standing there at the Umschlagplatz. The Germans had just taken him out of the shul, holding on to a Sefer Torah. And together with 28,000 other Yidden, Rav Moshe Chaim Lau was about to be deported to Treblinka. Days earlier, when the Nazis ordered that all the Jews shave off their beard and payas, so the community comes to the Rav, should we follow orders? And the Rav said, you have no choice, v'chai bahem, pikuach nefesh, but the Rav was stricter with himself. Not just to keep up the Messiah, but he felt he needed to preserve the kavod of the Rabbanos, which is the kavod HaTzibur. And Yisrael Meir is watching the Nazi approach his father with a mica, with the club. He smashes him on the head. He kicks him with the nailed boots. And he sees his father falter from the force of the blow. And somehow, with astonishing spiritual strength, Rav Moshe Chaim Lau braces himself and stands tall, not to undermine the dignity of the Rav in front of the Nazi. And then he's deported to Treblinka. And all the women and children are gathered into the main synagogue, into the big Beis HaKnesses in Pietrikov, where they're forced to witness the most inhumane scenes. And there's a woman standing in the Ezras Nashim. She's holding on with her two hands to the railing of the Ezras Nashim. And the Ukrainian guard sees the woman's hands, and there's a ring on the hand, and he calls out to her in Russian, "Davai, davai, give it to me, give it to me." And she's frozen. And the Ukrainian guard races upstairs, pounces on the old lady like a tiger, stomps on her, and rips off the ring. That was the atmosphere in the shul on that evening. Hundreds of women and children packed into the cramped shul, gripped with pure terror, fearing for their lives. And in the middle of the night, suddenly the shul doors swing open. And two Gestapo, they light a lamp, and they're standing there by the door, facing each other with a very narrow passageway between these two Yamach Shemams. And in a thunderous voice, one of them calls out, "I'm now going to read a list of names. If your name appears on the list, get out of here. Schnell, schnell, run away." He begins to read the list of those who would be released. The first name he reads is Chaya Lau, but she doesn't move because she's waiting for him to read the names of her two children who are with her in the shul. Yisrael Meir, who is 5 years old, and Shmuel, who is a teenager. She's not moving without her children. And the Nazi reads the list, and he's finished reading the names, and everyone knows that if your name is not on the list, your fate has been sealed inside that shul. And Chaya Lau does not move. And the Gestapo shouts, "There's one person here whose name I called that has not moved. Last chance." And this woman, her maternal instinct is aroused. She surveys the narrow passageway in between these two Nazis. And she shouts out, I'm coming, hoping the door would remain ajar. She plans the move quickly and decisively. She didn't have to tell her two boys to keep as quiet as possible. There's only one way they're going to do this. They're going to have to meld together as one body inside of her coat. She plans to smuggle out both of her children in the dead of the night. So the three of them walk sideways to try to be as close together. Somehow the three of them are going to smuggle out of that narrow passageway in between the two Gestapo. Yisrael Meir, the little boy, got through. Chayalau followed. And as Shmuel is walking out, the Nazi noticed just a little bit more movement than anticipated. And just then, he slams down his arm, blocking Shmuel's exit. And the boy falls to the floor and remains inside the shul. Yisrael Meir and his mother were safe outside. Shmuel was on the inside of the shul. They never saw him again. Later that day, Shmuel was deported to Treblinka. I'm sure many of you are aware that this Yisrael Meir would eventually survive that selection, the horrors of the Holocaust, became a Rav in Tel Aviv, and later Chief Rabbi of Israel. And Rabbi Lau writes that the question that plagues him and inspires him and motivates him every day of his life was not what did the Ribbon Shalom do, but why me? Why was I saved and my brother was left behind? What does the Ribbon Shalom want from me? What am I doing here? What's my mission? Ma choivasi ba'ilami. Marv Rabbi, as we read the Kinnis this morning, and we go through the table of contents of Jewish history, and we look through the rear view mirror of our past, there's one very serious question that we all should ask ourselves. What in the world am I still doing here? How am I still around? In the Holocaust of Egypt, 80% of Klal Yisrael perished. Apparently, our direct ancestors made it through, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. And in the Midbar, 90% of Klal Yisrael did not make it through. And Churban Bayis Risha, and the death toll was enormous. And Churban Bayis Sheni, Josephus writes, the Romans slaughtered 1.1 million Yidden, but our direct ancestors obviously survived that selection. If we're still here today, that means we survived selection of the Crusades when tens of thousands of Yidden were massacred. 1391, 200,000 Jews were forcibly baptized, lost forever in Spain. 1492, tens of thousands murdered. Chmielnicki pogroms, gas chambers, crematoria. For a Jew to be sitting in this room today, it's not statistically unlikely, and it's not highly improbable. It's downright impossible. How then could we not ask ourselves the question, what are we doing here? What does the Ribbon Shalom want from us? Why was I selected? Since time immemorial, Tisha B'Av has always been selection day. Ever since the first Tisha B'Av, when there was a gzeira after the Chet HaMeraglim that none of the men between 20 and 60 would make it out of the Midbar, that first year, 600,000 Jews dug their graves, not knowing if they would wake up in the morning. And 15,000 Jews remained b'kivreihem, and there was crying and mourning and moaning in thousands of homes in the Midbar. And the next year another 15,000, and the next year another 15,000, until Klal Yisrael was left with only 15,000 men between 20 and 60. And that Tisha B'Av night, the last remaining 15,000 men dug their graves thinking that would be their last night. And how pleasantly surprised they were when they actually woke up in the morning. And those remaining 15,000 Jews entered Eretz Yisrael together with the children, together with the teenagers, together with some Zakenim. And you could imagine that when these survivors entered Eretz Yisrael, they understood they were the she'eris, they were miyuta de miyuta, who survived Mitzrayim and survived the Midbar. And they entered Eretz Yisrael biyad Rama, and they understood they were hand-picked, cherry-picked to take hold of Eretz Yisrael for the future of Klal Yisrael. And it should have been smooth sailing. But in Kriyas HaTorah this morning we read that the challenge is ki soiled banim uvnei banim. They had children, they had grandchildren, v'noishantem ba'aretz, they got used to Eretz Yisrael, and they thought Jewish life began when Yehoshua ben Nun crossed the Yarden. And they forgot they were survivors of the Midbar and Mitzrayim. That's the challenge of ki soiled banim uvnei banim. And that's the exact challenge that we face today. Maybe in the 50s and the 60s, survivors, children of survivors, recognized, understood where they came from, that they were the miyuta de miyuta that remained after so many thousands of years of Jewish history. But now we've reached the stage in America, or wherever we are, of kisoilid banim uvnei banim. We're not the children anymore. Now it's the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the survivors. And we have the same danger of thinking Jewish life began on Coney Island Avenue 20 years ago. And that's why we need Tisha B'Av. And that's why we need Kinnos. And that's why we need to read the table of contents of Jewish history. To remember, to recognize that the Ribbon Shalom hand-picked every single Jew who's alive today and entrusted them with a mission, with a job, with a purpose. Forgive the word usage now. It's to make a point. You know, there's a big question about Moshe Rabbeinu. Why do we call him by his non-Jewish name? Moshe is not his Jewish name. Moshe is the name that the daughter of Paroi gave him. She's coming down to the Nile. She sees this little baby floating in the crib that his mother made so he shouldn't be devoured by the crocodiles or drowned by the waves. And the Torah says she stretched out her arm and she reached out to him, Vatikra Shemoi Moshe Kimin Hamayim Ishisihu. Why in the world do we use this name? It's not a Jewish name. Lahavdil. It's like calling someone Eric, Jeffrey, Kevin. Moshe is not his Jewish name. Moshe had plenty of Jewish names. When he had a bris milah, his mother gave him Jewish names. Avigdor, Yekusiel, Yehonasan. Something wrong with a Jewish name? And even more difficult, the Ribbono Shel Olam calls him Moshe. You know, Moshe is working for the Shver in the Midbar. He's tending the family sheep. And he sees the bush. And the bush, it's burning, and it burns, and it burns, and it burns, and it burns. Chazal say that that bush was burning for a very, very long time. Not only that, a lot of people passed by the bush. But everyone was busy. Everyone was on the way to the store or doing carpool or something. And they said, look, isn't it funny the bush is burning? And they went weiter. But not Moshe. Moshe said, Asura no va'era hamara hagadol hazeh, madua lo yivar hasneh. Moshe said, let me stop for 1 minute. What's going on over here? I know the market is still open. I know things are still happening. But could I just stop for a minute? Va'eres hamara hagadol hazeh, madua lo yivar hasneh. The Ribbon Shalom says, I've been waiting a long time for someone to do that. Vayar Hashem kisar lirois. The Ribbon Shalom said, that's my guy. Somebody stopped. That's my man. I've been waiting for someone to stop. And all of a sudden, from the middle of the bush comes the resounding voice of the Ribono Shel Olam, Moshe, Moshe. Why is the Ribono Shel Olam using Moshe's Gentile name? What's wrong with Avigdor, Yekusiel, Yoinasan? It's a big question. So I have a friend in yeshiva, his name is Ezra Gortz. He's a grandson of Rabbi Wein. So he sent me a clip of Rabbi Wein speaking, not sure what it was, maybe a family event. He asked the question, he gives a tremendous answer. To make a long story short, Rabbi Wein says whenever he comes to Yerushalayim, he goes to Yad Vashem, he goes to the Holocaust Museum, and on one occasion they told him there's a new exhibit, there's a new branch of the museum, there's a new children's memorial for 1.5 million Jewish children under the age of 12 who perished in the Holocaust. And the number 1.5 million, it's kemat impossible to fathom. You take this room, take another 1,000 of this room, and then do that 10 more times. And we're getting there. And there's a Jew in Beverly Hills. His name is Spiegel, Hungarian Yid. 70-something years ago, he goes to Auschwitz with his 5-year-old kid and his wife. 10 months later, he comes out alone. So he comes to Yad Vashem, he says, here's $4.5 million. I want to make a memorial for my 5-year-old son, but not just him. I want to make a memorial for the 1.5 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. And then over the years, he's given another $10 million to keep it up and to endow it. And Rabbi Wein says he heads to the memorial with the preconceived notion of what a Holocaust memorial should look like. He's been to many. He figures he'll see pictures, videos, books, pamphlets. But he was completely unprepared for what he saw. You walk into a room 8 to 10 stories high, maybe 5 times taller than this room. And the room is pitch black. It's so dark you can't even put one foot in front of the other. It's palpably black. It's like makas choshech. You could feel the darkness. V'yomesh choshech. And your eyes cannot even adjust to the darkness. And after rubbing your eyes for a few moments, you look in the center of the room, and what do you see? There's one candle that is lit. And by the genius of the designer and the architect, through reflections, through mirrors, the one candle becomes 1 million lights in a sea of darkness. So all you see are 1 million pinpoints of light in the all-pervading darkness. And there's a voice over it. And there's a tape that plays. And the tape does nothing but reads names. Hillel Cohen, 3 years old, Vilna. Miriam Goldberg, 7 years old, Sarajevo. Names, 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 until you go insane and you want to run out of the room. And Rabbi Wein said that when he left the room, there's one thought that remains with him. I didn't hear my name. I'm of age. I didn't hear the guy say my name. It's not on that tape. And I said to myself that if my name is not on that tape, then I could still do something in this world. Then I'm not going to give up. And if I could learn another Blat Gemara, if my name's not on that tape, then I'm going to do it. And if I could take another kid into my yeshiva, then I'm going to do it. And if I could do one more mitzvah, then I'm going to do it. If my name wasn't called. And then said Rabbi Wein, he finally understood why the Ribono Shel Olam called him Moshe. Every time the Rebbeinu Shalom called him Moshe, he reminded you. You could have been drowned. You could have been eaten by the crocodiles, like the other tens of thousands of Jewish children in Mitzrayim. Moshe, Moshe, if you're still here, can we get something done? Can we do something, please? You could have shared the same fate as the rest of the Jewish children. And Moshe has no choice but to say, Hineni, you got me. Let's get something done. If you paid careful attention to the kinnis, we read 45 kinnis this morning. How can you not help but think that if I'm not in that kinnis, then the Rebbeinu Shalom is calling out to me. And he's saying, Moshe, Moshe, I cherry-picked you. I hand-picked you. You're from the 1% of Klal Yisrael that made it through. Can we get something done? Can we try to accomplish a little bit? That's the message of the kinnis. That atem nitzavim hayoim kulchem. That somehow, somewhy, we're still here. And then there's no limit to how much we could strengthen ourselves, strengthen our families, strengthen our community, and strengthen Klal Yisrael. If you're able to hear the call of the Rebbeinu Shalom, Moshe, Moshe, and you realize that we did not share the same fate as the rest, the Ruba of Klal Yisrael, then you'll be elevated, you'll be inspired, you'll be motivated, and you'll be able to accomplish L'mala min hateva. You know, when the Mir Yeshiva relocated during the Holocaust, they took the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Russia, from there to Japan, ultimately to Shanghai. The Talmidim of the Mir Yeshiva in Shanghai are reputed to have learned with an otherworldly hasmada. I read that Rav Nachum would learn with Rav Shmuel Birnbaum every day, 12 hours without interruption. So I heard from a Rav in my neck of the woods, Rabbi Moshe Weinberger. He said he heard years ago from an Alter Mirror that the Talmidim in Shanghai held that they learned in a way that nobody ever learned in the history of Klal Yisrael. And not because there were no distractions. It's because they understood Torah was being destroyed in Europe. There was no Torah in America, and the Olam HaYeshivas in Eretz Yisrael was kemat ve'einenu. Hitler then was primed to attack Palestine. They literally felt the achrayus that the entire future of the Torah HaKdosha rested on their shoulders. They heard the Rebbeinu Shalom saying to them, Moshe, Moshe, if you're still around, can we get something done? And they felt they were selected by the Rebbeinu Shalom so that there should be a continuity to the Torah. And they were able to respond, Hineni, in an unprecedented way. Moreover, Rabbi, we're coming to the end. We would like to think we're the Dor Achroin. We're Ikvisa de Meshicha. We're the Miyuta de Miyuta. The Rebbeinu Shalom selected each Yachid. He cherry-picked each Yachid for the most important job in the history of Klal Yisrael. To cry out to him to bring the Geula Shalema. We have no idea why us. But if you understand that and you hear the cry, Moshe, Moshe, then you'll be empowered to stand up and to answer Hineni. Let's try to get something done. In 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946 Rabbi Wein writes he was 11 years old. And he lived in Chicago. He's a Ben Yachid. And one day his father tells him, Beryl, we're going to the airport. There's a big tzaddik coming. He's coming to visit America. And all the Rabbanim are coming to escort him to the shul where he's going to speak. Who's the tzaddik? Rav Isaac Halevi Herzog, chief rabbi of Palestine. He was a majestic personality. He lit from the plane carrying a silver cane and a Tanakh with a shiny top hat. He had a very aristocratic demeanor. And the whole community of Chicago accompanies this great Rav to the shul from Chicago Midway Airport, a gathering of Rabbanim, Balabatim, and some 200 yeshiva bachrim from the Skokie Yeshiva. And Rav Herzog gave a 45-minute shiur in Yiddish. And then he turns to the young boys, to the young men, and he says, I would like a word with you in English. I just returned from Rome. I had a meeting with Pope Pius XII. I had with me a list of the names of 10,000 Jewish children who had been placed with Catholic families and institutions from parents hoping to save their children during the Holocaust. And I said to the Pope, we only gave you the children because we didn't think we or our children would survive. But here's the list. I have their names, their parents' names. Do not hold on to our children. Do not kidnap our children. I have their names and the names of their parents. And the Pope flatly refused. Said the Pope, I will not even give you one child. The law is that once a child is baptized, we will never return him to another religion. Each one of these children was baptized, and the doors were closed on me, says Rav Herzog. And Rav Herzog was standing there at the podium, so overcome with emotion. He put his head down on the podium, and he wept, and he wept, and he wept. Rabbi Wein writes, I was never so frightened in my entire life. The shul was deathly silent. And then the rabbi defiantly lifted his head. His face was red. He looked like a lion. And he cried out to all the young men. He said, there's nothing I could do for these 10,000 children. They're lost forever. But I ask you, what are you going to do for the children of Klal Yisrael? What are you going to do to rebuild the Jewish people? And he repeated himself again and again and again. Don't forget what I'm telling you. Then we all filed by him to shake the hand, to receive a bracha. And he looked each one of us in the eye. And he turns to us and he says, did you hear what I told you? Are you going to forget what I told you? Don't ever forget what I told you. Rabbi Wein writes that my entire life, Rav Herzog's words ring in my ears. Whenever I'm discouraged, whenever I'm disheartened, I hear Rav Herzog's cry, what will you do for the future of Klal Yisrael? And those words challenge me and shape many of the decisions of my life. After reading all of the kinnis, after understanding we are miyuta de miyuta, the sheiris of the sheiris of the sheiris, how can we not hear the call of the Ribono Shel Olam, Moshe, Moshe? And therefore on Tisha B'Av, we cannot afford to stay on the floor. We cannot afford to wallow and feel self-pity and feel sorry for ourselves. All we could do is stand up from Nefila. I'll tell you a vart from a Pinchas Koritzer. Why does kinnis begin with the letter Samach? So you say, because it doesn't. It begins with a shin. No, it begins with a Samach. If you look in the first kinna we say this morning, kinna Vav, There are 8 prakim. Each parak has 7 psukim. Each sentence comes from one of the 7 aleph bases of Eicha. The Medrash Psikta says there's 7 aleph bases in Eicha. Parak Aleph, 22 psukim, Aleph through Taf. Parak Beis, Parak Gimel has another 3. Parak Daled, and Parak Hey has 22 psukim. It's not according to the flow of the Aleph base, but, says the Medrash, since there are 22 psukim, the first pasuk is Keneged Aleph, the second is Keneged Beis, and the 15th is Keneged Samach. And the first parak of Kinnis is Shin, Samach, 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 Samach. But the Shin is Keneged the Samach. Shavas is the 15th pasuk of the 5th parak. As for Pinchas Karatzer, why do Kinnis begin with the Oy Samach? We know in Ashrei there are 22 stanzas. For each letter of the Aleph Beis, there's only one letter not represented, the Ois Nun. Says Gemara in Brachos Daled Amud Beis, David HaMelech did not want to be merames to the nefila of Klal Yisrael. V'afal Pikein, says the Gemara, Miyad Samach Oisoi, Soimech Hashem L'chol Hanoiflim. Says Pinchas Karatzer, Kinos is the ultimate nefila. So miyad, Rabbi Lezer HaKalir is masmich Klal Yisrael with 7 samachs. Soimech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. We can't stay on the floor. We never stay on the floor. Immediately we have Ezer min hashamayim, Soimech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. Look in the Torah. Vayivku ha'am b'layla ahu, vayahas kolev. Samach Rabasi, there's a big Samach. Soimech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. Says Pinchas Karatzer, whenever there's nefila, whenever there's the Ois Nun, the Rebbeinu Shalom comes immediately with the Ois Samach. What happens when the Ois Samach is juxtaposed to the Ois Nun? Nes! That's why Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. The ultimate Nun, the ultimate Nefila, the Rebbeinu Shalom comes immediately to be Masmich, Soimech Hashem, L'chol Hanoiflim, with the birth of Mashiach Tzidkenu on Tisha B'Av. That's why Kinnos begins with the Oy Samach. And that's why we don't stay on the floor. 1944, the Matzav in Eretz Yisrael was Bo Mayim Ad Nafesh. There was a convention in Zichron Moshe because they got clear word for the first time that the Olam HaTorah was Kemat Nechrav in Europe. The Matzav in Eretz Yisrael was Shreklach. Funding from Europe stopped. From America and England, it was Kemat non-existent. And there was a convention of Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbanim, Bachrim, one of the Bachrim there, Reb Shloima Hoffman, Talmud of Rav Isaac Sher. He writes in a very interesting new sefer, you could feel the tension, the anxiety, the worry in the air. The visiting Rabbanim were profoundly worried. The Lutzker Rav, Rav Zalman Sorotzkin, got up to speak. All he could say is the Torah is b'sakana. The Matzav is shreklach, and everyone broke out crying. No one had what to say. Manoimer manadaber. Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer continued the same theme. And then rises the Panovich Rav, Rav Yosef Shloima Kahaneman. Recently came to Eretz Yisrael. Many of the Rabbanim there are hearing Rav Kahaneman for the first time. And he stood at the bima, and his face was beaming with simcha de kedusha. And they're looking at him like, what planet did he come from? And Rav Kahaneman said, I hear the voices of sadness, the voices of despair. Don't we have a havtacha? Didn't the Rebbeinu Shalom promise us, Ki lo yisishachach mi pizaroi? Do you know what this means? Do you know how fortunate we are? If the situation is so bleak, then we are going to be eligible for the greatest siyata d'shmaya in the history of Klal Yisrael. Don't let the opportunity slip away. Don't fade away in desperation. Get up. Be mechazik yourself. Strengthen yourself. and take advantage of the momentous occasion. Says Rav Shlomo Hoffman, in those few moments, Rav Kahneman changed the atmosphere in that room and the entire atmosphere in Eretz Yisrael. The entire assembly left with energy and strength to be Meroimim Keren HaTorah. And that's how we get off the floor on Tisha B'Av. And we rise up from our tsar, and we rise up from our despair. After the Nun, we rise up with the Samach of Soimech Hashem L'chol Hanoiflim. And we're energized, we're invigorated, we're strengthened to gain Siyata D'Shmaya. L'roimim Keren Yisrael. L'roimim Keren HaTorah. L'hagdol Torah L'adira. We should all be zoichet to see very soon the Bias Goyal Tzedek, the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, Sheyibane B'mhera V'yameinu. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.